This podcast is brought to you by Play for Peace, where nonprofit organizations create. This podcast is brought to you by Play for Peace. We're a nonprofit organization creating compassionate leaders in conflict zones across the globe. Today's episode is going to be really cool. It's touching on peaceful protests throughout history, specifically with Mahatma Gandhi. And we're going to even be sharing some things that you might not have known about Mahatma Gandhi towards the end of the episode. So make sure you're listening throughout that. My name is Heather. My pronouns are she, they, and let's get into today's episode.
These navigators everywhere, we play for peace. Peace navigators everywhere, we play for peace. Oh, we play for peace. We play for peace.
Many of you are familiar with the movement leader Mahatma Gandhi. However, those of us who are younger, such as myself, may not be fully aware of his exact contributions. Here's one of them. The Salt March was a peaceful and non-violent protest led by Gandhi against British rule, and it covered a 239-mile route from Sabarmati Ashram to Dandi. Both are located in Gujarat, India. This 24-day journey took place from March 12, 1930 to April 6, 1930, and the journey started with 78 of Gandhi's followers, including himself. This nonviolent protest was against the British salt tax. The British salt tax was essentially set in place to exercise their control over the supply of this mineral by imposing taxes on it. And these taxes, of course, paid a lot of money to the traders, but were crippling to those living in poverty. Salt was and still is a staple in the Indian diet, yet they weren't allowed to collect or sell it. A lot of people didn't take Gandhi's protest seriously at first. However, Gandhi chose this as the primary focus of his protest because it would resonate with all classes of Indian citizens due to how important it was in their daily lives. When Gandhi and his supporters reached the sea, they all picked up a small handful of salty mud, which was then mixed with seawater and evaporated to make the actual salt. At the time, such a simple yet necessary act was illegal. Before they created this illegal salt, Gandhi raised his hands to the sky, and with a handful of mud in his hands, he spoke these words. With this, I am shaking the foundations of the British Empire. For Gandhi, this was more than just a peaceful protest in time. He stated, truth, satya, implies love, and firmness, agraha, engenders and therefore serves as a synonym for force. I thus began to call the Indian movement Satyagraha, that is to say, the force which is born of truth and love or nonviolence, and gave up the use of the phrase passive resistance, in connection with it so much so that even in English writing we often avoided it and used instead the word Satyagraha. Even though it didn't bring about immediate change, it was an instrumental catalyst for India's sovereignty and self-rule from Britain, due to the popularity the movement eventually gained. People started to realize the importance of Gandhi's message through his nonviolent acts. Because of the march, Britain understood that they needed the consent of India in order to successfully rule and control it. The Salt March reminded them that they did not have it. As the movement gained momentum, Gandhi instructed his followers to gather salt, a necessary mineral along the seashore. And as millions began to break salt laws, the British arrested over 60,000 people. Eventually, people started to boycott British-produced products such as cloth and other goods. This eventually started other offshoot protests. As the British cracked down with more laws, the movement didn't crumble. This time was also a significant moment in history for Indian women. It was the first time that mass numbers of them got involved in political activities of any sort. And in the end, it took 17 years after the initial and subsequent satyagrahas for Britain to finally release control over India, which resulted in India's independence from Great Britain. In 2005, the Mahatma Gandhi Foundation celebrated 75 years by following Gandhi's exact schedule and route for the Salt March. The event was known as International Walk for Justice and Freedom. It started as a personal journey for Gandhi's great-grandson, Tushar Gandhi. Their journey began with 900 participants from 9 different nations. But as the days passed, the number of participants began to swell into the thousands. And today, the path that Gandhi took with his followers has officially been declared the Dandi Path, a historical heritage route. Years after the Salt March, there was one leader in North America who Gandhi deeply inspired. Martin Luther King was incredibly moved by the Salt March. He states, "Like most people, I heard of Gandhi, but I never studied him seriously. As I read, I became deeply fascinated by his campaigns of nonviolent resistance. I was particularly moved by his salt march to the sea and his numerous fasts. The whole concept of satyagraha, satya is truth, which equals love, and agraha is force. Satyagraha, therefore, means truth force, or love force, was profoundly significant to me. As I delved deeper into the philosophy of Gandhi, my skepticism concerning the power of love gradually diminished, and I came to see for the first time its potency in the area of social reform. The bigger lesson from me, and I'm sure what Martin Luther King learned, is that if it's an issue that affects a large percentage of the population, then we should support those causes to the best of our ability, especially when it comes to the impact it may have on those who are disadvantaged. Now, many of you may not be aware of Gandhi's complicated legacy, so I'm going to briefly break it down for you. In his 20s, Gandhi firmly believed in segregation and that the white race in South Africa was the superior one. I know. It's believed that closer to his 30s, he no longer spoke about Africans being inferior. Then there was the issue of his marital abuse and misogyny towards his wife, nieces, and other women. Now, I know it's commonly held to regard figures like Gandhi in the highest of regard, but the truth is he had his fair share of demons that obviously should have been dealt with quite differently. But what we can learn from him is that imperfect people can also bring about the change that we so desperately need. In today's world, it's empowering and it restores my hope in humanity to see many of us holding our leaders accountable for their errors. That's the only true way that we can ensure that leaders understand that they're no different than us when it comes to holding each other to a certain standard of love, respect, honesty, and integrity. For us as an organization, our goal has always been to bring peace where there is conflict. And since the late 90s, Play for Peace has been improving the lives of children living in conflict zones across the globe, such as our programs across India. Gandhi reminds us that we should stop until the problem is rectified. And that's why we won't stop until every conflict zone across the globe has a Play for Peace club that turns incredible youth into compassionate leaders. You never know. A child your donation supports may be the next Mahatma Gandhi for their generation in terms of the change that they bring. Now, imagine thousands more Mahatma Gandhis in each and every continent, country, city, town, village, and district, all because of the incredible donations that our family, you, who've been able to hold us together throughout the years. If you enjoyed the podcast today and want to support our movement, visit www.playforpeace.org. And don't forget to follow us on social media at playforpeace.org. Until the next episode, I'm Heather, and you're listening to Peace Navigators, a Play for Peace podcast for everyone, everywhere.